We're ready to go for the afternoon session. The topic is, whose world is it? We don't usually promote books here, but at least one of the participants has written one that says it's no one's world. Worth reading. And we are very, very lucky for this session to have someone who I've never really met, but I listen to her voice all the time, Lisa Mullins from The World on PRI. So, Lisa, it's up to you.
Thank you. It's a total pleasure for me to be here, and thank you all for coming to this afternoon session as well. I want to mention that last night at dinner time, fantastic dinner as you know, one of the younger people who is represented at my table looked as the waiter lifted this beautiful silver dome over the pasty, the chicken and almond pasty. And this gentleman kind of leaned forward and snapped a picture. And I thought, a man after my own heart, he's taking a picture of this fantastic dish. And then the lamb and the vegetables arrived, and he did the same thing. As soon as the waiter got up and left, he snapped a picture. And I said to him, I would love to have some of those pictures. Can you send them to me? Thinking, this is great. I'll just give him my little flashcard. And he said, oh, no problem, they're on Facebook. And I said, what? Now, Kumaradev, you're here someplace. Where are you? There you are, yes. What's up with that?
Hello. Hi. So it's just this technology called iFi, which cuts away with all of taking the pictures and processing them and all of that stuff. You take a picture and it just uploads to wherever you want it, Facebook, Flickr, Twitter, whatever you like.
Immediately?
Immediately.
Yes, and what's it called?
iFi.
iFi.
Yeah.
Instead of Wi-Fi. It's terrifying.
It is. You've got to be
I was really frightened. Although I was also, what's that?
You've got to be a good photographer and not make mistakes when you take the picture, because if it goes online, then, you know.
Yes, but it's also the reason that I did not ask you to take a picture of me and those other people around the table, because there's no editing involved. So I was loving this, and I was also slightly mortified. By the way, the picture's up there right now? Yeah. Yes, good, but not of us around the table. It's really cool, and I realized this is really the new world that we're facing. Such is the world that there are things that might be small, microcosmic dinner table morsels, and then there are macroscopic changes that we're talking about on this panel. Seismic changes in international order, whether we marvel at them, as I did last night, or shaken by them, as I was last night, we are indeed living with them. Charles Kupchan, you wrote a book. It is called, and it's about this seismic shift, in fact. It's called No One's World, The West, The Rising Rest, and the Coming Global Turn. Charles, second in from the left, what does this turn look like?
Well, by turn, I mean a moment in history in which the globe's center of gravity moves. And I think we're at the end of one long period of history that's lasted about 200 years. Started at the beginning of the 19th century, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And since then, first under Pax Britannica and then under Pax Americana, the West has been the guardian and the shaper, not just in power terms, but in ideological terms. And I think that period's coming to an end. And what's beginning is a new global turn in which the globe's center of gravity is shifting, the pendulum is swinging, but the argument in the book is that it's swinging everywhere and therefore nowhere. It won't be an American century, it won't be a Chinese century, it will be no one's world. And I argue that it's not just that power that is shifting, but it's also the beginning of a more ideologically diverse world in which liberal democracy, secular nationalism, and industrial capitalism, which I take to be the defining characteristics of the West, will have to compete with alternatives. State capitalism, political Islam, left-wing populism. And the punchline of the book is that we will be in a world that for the first time will be globalized and interdependent, in which we're all smushed together, but no longer anchored by the West. And that's going to make for a world that is potentially quite dangerous, but also full of opportunities in the sense that the demand for global governance, for a more equitable world is out there. The question is, will we rise to the occasion?
Let me ask you this before I turn to your fellow panelists. Why no one's world versus everyone's world? Or does that depend on if you're a glass half full or half empty type person?
Everyone's world to me would be slightly too optimistic. That is to say that everyone rises to the occasion, supplies public goods, works together cooperatively. I hope that we get there. But I think we live in a world where the default position is no captain at the helm, more competition. If we see that around the corner, it's more likely that we will map out this and get from here to there safely. If we assume that cooperation emerges naturally, we're going to get it wrong.
Okay, I want to introduce the fellow panelists right now and get your take on this, because we can assume that Charles is right. He'd probably like it if we did, but I know from speaking to some of you already that that's not necessarily the case. I think that might also be the case with some of his fellow panelists here, but we can find out from them right now. And then I want to proceed with your questions and comments as well to talk about the options if Charles, in fact, is right. Why don't we start off with the ambassador on the right, João de Almeida, who is the European Union's ambassador to the United States. Very good to have you here. Also here, Renato Flôres, professor of graduate school economics at, boy, did I forget to ask you how to pronounce this. Can you pronounce the name of the university in Brazil for me, please?
Renato.
Renato, your first name, I got that. Thank you. Fundação Getúlio Vargas University, close enough?
FGV.
Yes, thank you.
That's
I should have said that. FGV in Brazil. And among other things, he has a great interest in the economics of culture, which I would love to find out more about. Also, Assia Bensaleh Alaoui, who is the ambassador at large for King Mohammed VI and a specialist in international economic law. How about from the three of you right now? Ambassador, would you like to go first? What do you make of the idea of no one's world being ahead and the receding, however swiftly or slowly, of the West?
Thank you, Lisa. First of all, I was a sort of pioneer with a number of you last year in a much smaller event, so I'm extremely happy to see the success of the Atlantic Dialogues this time. Very happy to be here. I would say that I have disagreed more in the past with Charlie than I do about this book. We disagreed a lot when he foresaw the decline of the European Union or the fact that it was dying down. We've solved that little conflict that we had, and I basically agree with his line. But I would like to start, for the sake of argument, to challenge one way of presenting this issue, which I see very often, which is basically to say this is about the decline of the West and the rise of the rest. And I would like to challenge that a little bit, because I think this is too simplistic and, in any case, a sterile way of approaching the problem. What we're witnessing around the world is a rebalancing, but not necessarily a decline of ones in favor of the others. If anything is happening, is an expansion of the so-called Western values. Market economy, open trade, slowly and with some difficulty, democracy and freedom, rule of law, human rights. Millions of people have come out of poverty. Millions of people more today than in a few years live in democracy or transition to democracy. And I tend to believe that when we start a transition to democracy, it's more difficult to go back to non-democracy. So I'm hopeful that these transitions will lead to democracy. So in a way, and I say this for the sake of the debate, the rise of the rest is also the rise of the West. And I think if we don't approach this situation as a win-win operation of rebalancing power influence around the world, not much of a constructive outcome will be produced. So I like to throw this idea as a productive way of looking at this. But I agree with Charlie that we are in a turning point. Mm-hmm. We are in a transition. The question is, we don't know to what are we transitioning.
Right.
And that is the main question right now. My final comment in this first intervention is to say that I believe the European Union is a good reference for this debate. We have been a laboratory of regional globalization. I think there are things people can learn from us, maybe a few things you don't need to follow necessarily. But fundamentally, we brought together different countries, conflict management, conflict prevention, peace building, democracy building. From 6 to 28 countries, 500 million people have come together. And I think there are issues and lessons that we can learn and benefit from the European experience. Anyway, we are ready to not impose the model on anyone, but to inspire those who would like to see our experience as maybe a source for solutions of problems around the world. And I mentioned yesterday the Pacific region. On a personal basis, I'm particularly worried by the potential tension associated with the lack of mechanisms to deal with that kind of tension. I think in Europe we managed to find a good balance around all that.
Yeah, and the idea of even thinking about imposing the model for it, I think, is something that Charles takes issue with, and that is whether we'd even have that option. But we can talk more about that. Renato Flôres, what's your take on this?
Well, my first point is that to say that the center of gravity is shifting depends on how you compute the center of gravity. We have changed, of course. We have a redistribution of wealth, which is more in accordance with demographics and the distribution of natural resources. We have less ignorance, and we have more diversity. So I think that these three trends, they add up that things became neither better nor worse, but more complex. So, for instance, if we talk about cooperation in certain issues became more difficult. That's not bad. But the point is that in certain cases, and we had a session before about trade. If we look at the WTO, I was talking to my friend, Ambassador Alejandro Jara, yesterday. I asked him, how is the WTO going? He said, well, fine. We work every day. Rules are there. The WTO is perfect. But to a certain extent, the WTO had a climax about a few years ago. Nowadays, the way we do trade is changing. The rules at the WTO, in my view, and I can bet with anyone who is here, that in 5 to 10 years we'll have to change the rules. And concessions, according to the WTO scheme, actually, most of the members gave the most that they can give, taking into account their constituencies and their economic constraints. So we have a kind of limit to certain formats. And on the other hand, we have very complex problems. Like, for instance, I was a bit amazed yesterday that people were talking about transatlantic cooperation, and nobody mentioned the climate issue, the environment. The environmental problem is a huge problem. So whenever we try to address the environmental problem as a whole, that's a failure. That's very difficult. So this means that in a more diversified world, in which agents are more conscious of their possibilities, their constraints, and their desires, and in which we have a redistribution of wealth, not necessarily power. I don't disagree with Charles, but I think that the whole issue is more nuanced. You have to find the right variable, if you allow me the technical word, or the right point to negotiate. We saw at Rio+20. Rio+20, the big success of Rio+20 is that we managed to have a document instead of in Copenhagen, in which a document was impossible. But everybody says, well, it's too vague. Why? Because the problem is very complex. So what I think that in this new world, I don't know whether it is a big change from 200 to 1,000 years ago. We can go to history and we can use history the way we prefer. But the point is that I think that we must be more careful, more precise, and less ambitious when we talk about cooperation, when we talk about global rules.
Pick up on that, Charles, a little bit later, and I think Ambassador Alaoui, you have specialized in, among other things, global climate change. Perhaps you can bring that into the conversation a little bit later as well. But can you talk a little bit right now first about your take on the idea of a receding West?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the JMF and my friend from the SCP for having me here. And just to thank them and be provocative, I would like first to try to answer the global question, whose world is it? And probably the short answer would be, it's the world of firms and markets, the world of terrorists and crime cartels, because it set the international agenda and impact so heavily on the people's lives. We could probably as well, ask the question, whose world we are addressing? And probably we can say as well then the social networks, the media, which are providing us with a mix of virtual and real world. And that's why when I see that it is question of the decline of the West, I agree with Ambassador Almeida. I would like to challenge this idea. We are certainly at the end of an era, the era of the almighty white man, this is for sure. But at the same time, the West is still there. It is looming still on the psyches as well, and on a lot of other issues. But at the same time, what do we see is that the rise of a new era of uncertainties, with a lot of diffuse threats, with multiple centers of, if not decision, of certain influence. But we hope that perhaps we could have some kind of even unstable equilibrium to keep on moving. And my hope, since you have been mentioning hope, is that it can make some room as well for the voiceless. Because beyond the roar of the Arab revolutions, of the indignados, of Occupy Wall Street, just name it, from Chile to Alaska, are the concerns, the real concerns of people heard? Are they met? What global governance do to try to address them? So my hope is at least these voices, and this is we are very much concerned in the area, because my hope as well is that this larger Atlantic dialogue, even though transnational challenges do break geography, might probably focus on certain issues, making sure that it gives a priority to common issues and bring some common answers. And I think there was a lot of hope. Our Brazilian friend yesterday was mentioning the constructive approach and this complementarity potential between Africa and Brazil. And I think it's quite interesting to see that we could probably, through these issues, of course, we will have still to answer the very, very problematic issue, who will set the norms and how can you be more concrete about the implementation of such a huge agenda? But I do think that I'm less pessimistic about, this chaos, not saying that from chaos we will have, something positive, but at least you can have a reshuffling of cards, and smaller actors might be given a chance to play a role, making advantage of their own specificities, of their own knowledge about the background. And in that regard, I think that Morocco has a real role to play in this larger Atlantic dialogue.
Charles, what about residents of places such as Morocco, South American countries that we're not talking about quite as much? I mean, we talk a lot about Brazil in this forum. Other African countries, for instance. Are they the voiceless because they're not part of these emerging markets? I mean, who, in your vision for the next couple of decades, for the remainder of the century, have the voices and who doesn't?
Well, let me just clarify something, because I think it's important to the conversation, that I'm not arguing that the West is in decline.
I didn't say you were, but
right,
some people do.
I think the West will do just fine, and that what's unusual about this period in history is that it's not going to be one center of power that disappears like the Soviet Union or the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. We will hold our own, but there will be the emergence of alternative centers of power with their own models. The place where I think I would most disagree, perhaps with João and some of the others, is whether the world is converging toward Western values. When I look at China, when I look at other parts in the world, I see some progress in that direction, but I also see cultural, socioeconomic formations that are very different. Coming directly to your question, Lisa, I think, and someone mentioned this in our conversation already here in Rabat, I think the world is going to get more and more regional, and that countries like Morocco will end up actually having more voice because geography, regionalism, and regional institutions matter more and more over time. If I'm right, that at the level of global governance, we will be stumbling to some extent, and then one drops down to regional actors. So I would say some of the most important institutions of the next world, in 2025, 2030, will be the Gulf Cooperation Council, ASEAN in Southeast Asia, UNASUR and Mercosur in South America, perhaps a new kind of multilateral framework in North Africa that might link it both to South America and to Europe. In other words, a devolution of power to regional actors, which will increase the voices of small states.
So, okay, yes, Ambassador. And then I'd love to get some questions in a minute for those who want to raise their hand, and a microphone will be sent your way.
I fully agree with Charlie's last point, which echoes other points made about the role of small countries or small actors or lesser visible actors. And the region that I mentioned, I came back to my own experience in the European Union, where sometimes people think that the big countries call all the shots. My experience in the Union is that smart, small and medium-sized countries can call a lot of shots. And there's a room for them even in an integrated space with the 4 or 5 very big countries. Second point on the decline of the West, to complement my narrative. I think the West needs to deserve the recognition that it is not in decline. What do I mean by this? I think the West needs to prove that it is capable of engaging with those who are rising. That the West needs to prove that it is able to support long and sometimes difficult transition processes towards democracy. That the West needs to engage more in accepting differences, in accepting the bumps of transition periods. And we cannot support elections and the following day be unhappy with the result of the elections and want to change the result of the elections. We need to be able to see longer term and accepting that these processes are bumpy roads, hopefully towards democracy and freedom. But I continue to believe that if we compare the world that we have today as the world we had when the Berlin Wall came down, we are closer to the expansion of Western values, that we are closer to the retraction of Western values around the world.
Renato?
Yeah, I would like to bring a concept of cultural economics to the discussion. I don't know whether we are closer to something or not, but in the economics of culture, I mentioned the word diversity. And we all agree, we have this feeling that diversity is positive. Diversity is good. To UNESCO, there was the Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, which I think was a landmark, is very important. But we have a big problem, unsolved problem, in cultural economics, which is the following. If diversity increases too much, then you have confusion and you start to have negative effects. Nobody knows the right amount of diversity. If you look at the film industry, music industry, this is an enormous discussion. What is the right amount of diversity? Even whether the question makes sense. We know that diversity is positive, but if you have too much diversity, then things become complicated. I think that what we are living, experience now in the world is this, diversity has increased. So, in certain issues, as in the environmental issue, it's evident that we need to create a new way to negotiate the environmental issue, because there's too much diversity, too many agents, too many problems.
I love
We have
that
to
idea.
find other ways.
I would love to pick up on that, too much diversity and what
That's
the dangers
point.
are when things
in
become
other
messy.
areas, in the past, we had too few diversity. So agents who were used to control international organizations and other things, now they get surprised because they are experiencing a more diversified environment. This is normal.
Yes, messy, but normal. And yeah, is your fear that there would be homogenization, you're saying?
No, we have different outcomes. In certain areas, we have more diversity, which was needed. In other areas, we have too much diversity. We'll need either a creative solution or a centralized solution.
Ambassador Alaoui?
Well, I would like to respond very briefly to 2 points. The point about still this decline of the West, and especially Europe, that you were mentioning. I think that they still have a responsibility because they have to be responsible for a few things, and especially to exercise the leadership in a different manner, an inclusive leadership which will accompany the emergence of the states which are in transition, which are facing tremendous challenges across the spectrum of issues, from security to globalization, economic and social developments, and climate change, and especially jobless youth with huge expectations. I'm talking only about our region. And I think that Europe and the United States should not shun from their role in accompanying these revolutions, and I deplore that sometimes they subcontract, and probably to the wrong actors, what they should be doing themselves in a much better way, to make sure they reassure and not threaten that there is accompanying all this huge aspiration to differentiation, but as well to a better life and to democracy. This is the core of the question, and we are still facing tremendous challenges to get where we want to be, because we have as well a huge threat, which is looming not only over the region, but across the world. It's populism, which can be even much more detrimental to the lack of democracy, because it is going to make huge promises and will not deliver. And then you end up with huge frustrations. That's why we do need the accompanying of this still very powerful powers, excuse me the redundance, but it is the way. And the only thing is that probably we have to craft better tools, better instruments, find different approaches to make sure that they are at the same time full of justice and human rights that they really want to promote, and at the same time efficient as far as governance is concerned, because governance is dramatically lacking in the national level, but as well on the international agenda.
Charles, it strikes me we have actually a worldwide audience for this panel and all the plenary sessions that are going on as part of the Atlantic Dialogues, because we're online, so people can watch this live. Not everybody, of course, has been listening to the previous panel discussions. So when we talk about those countries that have, or regions where power is emerging, maybe you can be more specific about it, about which countries you're looking at in particular in the book.
Well, I think that if the world becomes more regional, then one can imagine, and I think I'll side with João here, EU-like organizations in which the major powers take the lead, but in which smaller powers array themselves around those major powers in various kinds of multilateral fora. So here, I'm thinking about if one's talking about East Asia, a situation in which obviously power still matters. China, a Sino-centric kind of Asia is probably lurking, but the best that one could hope for would be some kind of bargain between big states and small states about the rules of the road.
Maybe before you get to that, show me the map. Tell us where you're looking at in particular, for those people who have not been listening to other discussions.
On a global basis?
Yeah.
Well, I think that one can think about East Asia, South Asia, the broader Middle East, South America, North America. But what's new about this world is that there are networks that crisscross throughout all of these regions, binding them to each other. And so I think the world will become, that you'll see sort of what you would call a dual movement, that there'll be a regionalization to deal with local issues, because politics is still local, but that at the same time you'll have to lift governance up to the global level and try to do the coordination at the same time.
And again, looking at that same map, those networks that you're talking about, those networks that are the strongest, that have the strongest cords, the cords are what? What specifically? Economics?
It is a combination of economic interest, territorial issues.
Security issues?
Sorry?
Security issues?
Security and cultural issues. I mean, I think that culture still matters, that one of the reasons that the world will get more regional is both that countries closest to each other or closest to a problem area have more direct interests than those that are further away. And if I'm right that we're moving toward a world in which there won't be a global guardian, then the United States isn't going to be sending out the fire trucks as it has in the past. And I would just give one example. America's closest ally in the world has flirted with meltdown, the EU. And the United States has not come to the rescue, in part because it can't. It has its own fiscal problems. That's a new world. And that's why I think we need to have a conversation about how to devolve responsibility, authority, obligation to new actors who will have the ability and the capacity to respond.
Let me turn it over to the audience now, and I want to give you something to think about among the many things that have been brought up already. One of the ideas that's been proposed is the idea of democracy as being kind of a basic tenet of a secure country and a quote-unquote legitimate country. Question is, will that be thrown up for grabs as these other regional alliances emerge and become very, very strong? And should we anticipate that that's actually a positive thing? If any of you want to speak to this, can we assume, for instance, that a cluster of nations that become powerful in a region will abide by the rule of law, and should they? Will they be okay with human rights? Will they embrace the idea of non-nuclear proliferation? Will they be okay with Iran having a nuclear weapons program? North Korea proliferating its nuclear weapons? Can we expect that that's going to be the case? Should they even embrace democracy? Does a viable opposition mean anything to them? Any thoughts on that? After. Thank you. Thank you. I want to give them their turn. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I'm delighted that you raised that, because that was precisely the question going through my mind as I was listening to all of you. And frankly, I found it surprising and somewhat distressing that over the last day and a half, we've seen a real lack of consensus, I think, among our speakers and audience members on the question of whether democracy is or should be a shared core value of a transatlantic partnership. That used to be essential to the narrower transatlantic partnership that we're now debating expansion of. But it seems to me that the notion that we have to set that aside in some sort of relativism is contrary both to history but also to empirical evidence. We have so much evidence now that transparent, accountable, responsive governance, that is, core to democracy, is necessary for developmental success over the long run. We have evidence that democracies over the long run do better on core human development and economic development than non-democracies. We have empirical evidence that democracies don't go to war with other democracies. Why are we still debating this?
Thank you. And I'd like to get one or two more comments on the same issue, if we can. Gentleman right over here. Do we have a microphone nearby? And thank you.
I'm John Richardson of German Marshall Fund. I wanted to say something about whether the Western paradigm, in particular of human rights, is spreading or not spreading in the world. And it is this, that it seems to me that the emphasis we have placed in the West on human rights as being individual rights is something which is associated with a phenomenon in Western society over the last 2 generations of secularization, to the point where most citizens in Western countries see their core values as being secular values, and religion as being at most an adjunct, a personal adjunct to those societal values, or irrelevant. I think that paradigm is under attack. And I give you 2 examples. One is in the United States, where you now have a large number of states where the schools use textbooks which take up books originally prepared in the state of Texas, which put creationism on the same level as evolution, as scientific theories. That is religion-based.
But it's certainly, I'm not sure it's a large number, but it certainly gets a lot of attention.
That is religion-based. And I think the same phenomenon comes in other countries, in particular in the Islamic world, where we're dealing with people for whom religion is the central set of values, and the secular values come in addition to those values coming from religion. And I think it's very difficult for the Western paradigm to understand that, and it may be something that we have to learn to understand if we're going to give, for example, if we're going to accept the human right that a person's religion is respected. Not just that person, but the religion of the person. And you all know what I'm referring to from the last few weeks.
Thank you. We have one more, and then we'll go to our panel. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Lyle White. I'm from South Africa. I think in terms of your reference to democracy and how this could bind a bloc together, I suppose the new BRICS grouping would be the one that would most represent this. And we can see that there's very, very little that actually holds this grouping together. And it's not even a formal grouping as such. But I can't see this actually gaining legs, and it should probably be nothing more than just a kind of a market dynamic. They are trying to morph it into something else. But as we know, there's IPSA as well, India, Brazil, South Africa, and China were notably excluded from that, and so were Russia, because of the principles of democracy. Just in terms of something that, and I think Charles's book is a refreshing take on this. The decline, the apparent decline of the West doesn't mean, and that's why this introduction is very, very important, doesn't mean the rise of another, or the rise of another doesn't mean the decline of the West, which is a very, very important discussion to have, because we always seem to see this as a zero-sum game. What is more is, we're not going to be seeing, in our session on global governance, there was some reference to how China, India, and Brazil are craving for power. They're not craving for power. In fact, they shy away from some form of global leadership, because from my position, where I can see in terms of how China engages with the global community and all the rest, it's all about national self-interest. They've got China, Brazil, India, South Africa, and a range of other so-called emerging powers. They've got such enormous problems back home. They've got such difficulties or such problems in the institutional fabrics there, they can't even hope to actually guide the institutional fabric on a global level.
There is a lot to respond to here. So let me just get kind of brief responses, whoever wants to speak first. Charles, probably most appropriately be you.
Just a couple quick points, and I'm going to hop on the back of John Richardson, whose point I thought was spot on, in that, I think that when one looks out at the world, one sees a diversity on fundamental issues that suggest that the West's rise, the nature of the West's political formations, its society, its relationship between state and church, between secularity and religion, this is not being universalized. It is a uniquely Western experience that has to do with the Reformation, with the fights that took place between the monarchs, the nobility, and the church, and it led to a particular kind of society in which many Westerners, not all, believe that the realms of religion and the realms of politics should be separated. In many parts of the world, that is not the case. In many parts of the Middle East, I think what we're seeing is the return of participatory politics, which is bringing religion back into political life. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it is a kind of modernity that stands in contrast to the kind of modernity that we've seen in the West. Coming to the question of democracy, I think the United States and its European partners are right to want to see democracy spread. But I think it needs to be kept in perspective. Are the Chinese about to embrace democracy? I don't think so. Should we, in our actions, in our rhetoric, treat China as illegitimate because it is not democratic? I don't think so. The Chinese have brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They are finding their own way to modernity. Yes, I'm comfortable criticizing them when they throw someone in jail, but we are moving to a world that is, I think, going to be much more politically diverse. We should stand by our values, but stop trying to force them down other people's throats.
By the way, does that mean that, that you said we should stand up for our values? Does that mean that we should expect the kind of return in 50 years that we do now when we castigate China, for instance, for particular human rights? Should we feel as entitled to get a hearing as we do now?
I think that we have a moral obligation to object to behavior that we find objectionable. But that is very different than believing that all cultures and peoples around the world should act and think like us. That's the mistake that we are making. That is why many emerging powers resent us. And I think we ought to get off that hobby horse.
Could you introduce yourself first?
Good afternoon. I'm Paul Oquist, Minister of National Policy of Nicaragua. I would like to ask the panel to react to the idea that perhaps the malaise is deeper and that it's not a matter of who's up and who's down, that maybe our civilization peaked some 30 years ago and is maybe 30 years into decline. 4 quick points to illustrate that. First, we keep destroying the environment. We keep heating up the planet, despite the fact that we have consciousness of this. In the run-up to Copenhagen, 2008, 2009, there was great concern about how to return to 300 parts per million of greenhouse gases. Now we're headed for 450 and maybe 600, and we seem to be in collective denial, with no capacity whatsoever to solve this problem. Second, our civilization in broad terms was based on a big, broad stroke towards greater equality, and societies not based on cohesion and coercion, not based on coercion rather, but towards social cohesion. In the last 30 years, we've seen a decline in equality, and it's now taking its toll on social cohesion. Third, if we look at the nuclear genie out of the bottle, there's not even attempts anymore to put the nuclear genie back into the bottle and eliminate nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons are still there. Finally, if we look at war, we tend to think that we're more civilized than our predecessors. But if we look back at the 19th century, wars were fought in the countryside so as not to damage cities or damage civilians. World War I brought mass military destruction, World War II mass civilian destruction, and all of the recent wars have many more civilian casualties than military casualties. Plus, we seem to become inured to the idea of permanent war, that as wars end, the discussion becomes where the next war is going to be, rather than trying to structure our civilization on the basis of no wars, which was attempted on many occasions in the history of our civilization, which seems to be not only in crisis, but in decline. Thank you.
It would be interesting if we can get a microphone here. I don't know if anyone in the back also has questions. I don't want to ignore you back there. Interesting to note at some point as well in terms of the nuclear issue, whether or not new alliances will mean less of a need for nuclear weaponry and more of an impulse toward restricting nuclear weapons and cutting them back. Just a thought for a future discussion. Yes, could you identify yourself?
Andreas Krämer, Ecologic Institute. I'm German, a country that has a strong history, but in the last century was taken on down a bad road by people who were claiming to have an ideology, a history on their side that allowed them to suppress human rights. To me, it's a personal statement because my family's history is entwined with that. And from the stories that I hear from my grandparents, from my parents, And from the stories that I hear from my friends from various parts of the world, Charles, I do not think that anybody who is going into prison in China because there's no rule of law, no recourse for people who are burning themselves because they feel their dignity was not respected in Tunisia, by people who have family members disappeared in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, or everywhere else, they do not buy that there is a separate set of values that allows their rulers to do that. The people have the same values as we do. They're Western values. And I hope you can modulate your statement a little bit.
Charles, why don't you respond to that, and then we'll take a few quick questions. And we're running out of time, so please keep your questions and comments really short. Charles, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that we should back away from that. I said quite explicitly that when somebody is thrown into jail in China, we should object to it and press the Chinese government to get them out. What I am objecting to is, and I don't know whether you were doing this or not, but comparing the Chinese government to the government of Nazi Germany. Right? I would say that the Chinese government is broadly interested in improving the welfare of its citizens. And I would draw a line between governments that exploit their citizens and that are predatory, and the governments that are broadly interested in improving their welfare. Now, I think that we are sophisticated enough to pursue an ambitious human rights agenda and at the same time realize that not everybody in the world is going to play by our rules. And my hope is that we can build a 21st century that is still rules-based. But we have to understand that in some cases, they will not be our rules. They will be rules forged in coordination with emerging powers, some of which are not democratic.
Okay, we're up against the clock, maybe right here. Thank you.
Nora Fischer-Onar, I teach international relations in Istanbul, Turkey, and I'm a Asmus fellow of the German Marshall Fund. Yes, we live in a post-Western world that was made in the West image. And Professor Kupchan, you gave the metaphor of Rome, and you said the West will last longer than Rome. But of course, Rome was neither built nor collapsed in a day. And in fact, it took centuries that it didn't collapse. It evolved into a synthesis with the culture of the barbarians, the Germans, that furnished the legal basis and the normative framework for European civilization. So building on what the ambassador was saying, and in a more sort of proactive move to think about how we can fill out the idea of democracy in a post-Western world, why don't Westerners actively engage concepts like solidarity or justice, which are powerfully grounded in Islam, for example, in order to embark on a meaningful two-way conversation about how the norms for our post-Western world. Because what I'm hearing now is we have our values, they have theirs. As long as they don't encroach on our freedoms, we're going to have to find a way to live together. But I think we can do more than that.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Let's move over to this side of the room. It's all over this side of the room. Everybody here has something to say. How about a microphone here? Thanks. And then you can hand it behind you after.
Ettore Greco, Institute of International Affairs in Rome. So I think a fundamental question remains how stable and secure this new diverse fragmented system will be. So Ambassador Almeida suggested that this could become a win-win solution, but this may appear a too rosy picture, because this would imply, if I understand well, that what counts is absolute power or capacities. We know in international politics in general, what counts is relative power. So we have clearly the need to accommodate and adjust the rising power. I accept the argument that they are not pursuing an hegemonic agenda, but still, they are becoming increasingly influential in their neighborhood. Regionalism, I accept I think the counter-arguments developed by Professor Flôres is really convincing. It's not a solution, and there are global issues to be dealt with, and I don't see an emerging system of global governance, new global institutions that can accommodate the requests of this rising power. So this is a question I think we cannot overlook. And so I would like to ask your assessment of this question, how this probably painful adjustment process can take place.
I'm going to ask you to hold the assessment to your final thoughts. Could you hand the microphone right behind you to that woman, please? Thanks.
Yes. Thank you very much. Jacqueline Hale from the Open Society Foundations. As someone active on human rights, I get very frustrated by the values issue. I don't really buy it. We all have our different values. It's all quite relative. Norms is much more interesting because when you think about it, you know, over 180 countries have signed up to a range of human rights norms. Surely that's the discussion we should be having, the norms and the conventions that governments have signed up to and they're failing to interact. That's something that any citizen can ask their government. My question stems from that. What do we do now in this new uncertain no man's world with regard to the international institutions which set up international human rights norms, international rules of the game? Do we ditch them? Certainly some might say that they're not at all, certainly the Bretton Woods institutions are not at all democratic or representative from the point of the new view of the new global power. So my question is, what do we do now with the institutions that set these norms? Will there be new architectures of power? Thanks.
I'm so front-loading the questions. Would you like to make a comment?
Just a question. I'm Salam Aboudarar. I'm from the Anti-Corruption Authority in Morocco. I wonder if I have well understood an idea raised by Mr. Flôres about diversity. I think that you said that diversity is good in general, but the excess of diversity could be a risk. Do you suggest there are ways and means to cope with the development of diversity? Is that right? And if yes, what means and what ways? Because
okay, we're gonna ask you to incredibly unfairly briefly give a response if you want to any of the questions that you would like to follow up on, and then I've got a 30-second answer from each of you, I hope, about our final question.
Well, first, diversity. No, it's very difficult. What I said is that too much diversity, you can have anything. You can have a chaotic situation. You can have a negative situation, even in cultural terms, because you can have a lot of confusion, noise, and we don't know how to deal with it. So this is one point. I would like to address the point of my Italian colleague and potential friend. People, yes, of course, you know, Brazil and Italy, we have a very old and strong relationship. We speak nearly the same language. And the point is the following. Everybody was mentioning China. Allow me to answer in an Oriental way. I think China's history is very interesting. I don't want to lecture, but I'm answering in 30 seconds. 6,000 years in 30 seconds. You know, Chinese historians, they had a big problem because the history of China, if you start to study, it's very confusing. Warring kingdoms, and suddenly you have a central empire, and then everything collapses. You have warring kingdoms again, you have usurpers, you have a very interesting multiplicity of characters. And after many, many, many centuries of trying to understand the Chinese history, there was a kind of broad consensus among the historians. They said, well, it's very easy to understand the history of China. If the empire has been united for a long time, it will be fragmented. If it has been fragmented for a long time, it will be reunited. So I think I miss it here, a dynamic view of the evolution. So what the insight in this, some people this may sound silly, but this is very deep. Why? Because when you have too much central power, There is a stress. Someone mentioned rules. There is an overkill. We are living nowadays an overkill of international norms. Too many norms. It's very complicated to follow them. Our friends from European Unions, they have a creativity. They create norms every week, and they think that everybody should follow them. Like REACH, the norm on chemical substances, which increased the cost of our exports to then in 30%. So there is an overkill of regulation. And so what the historians saw was this. If you have too much central power, there is a stress. You need fragmentation. You need a period of warring kingdoms, usurpers, warring states. More diversity, then you get fed up with too much diversity. You have big problems. You need more consensus. I think that I missed a dynamic view. What we are living, I don't know if it is a big shift in the center of gravity. Depends on the variable. If the variable is the number of soldiers, there is no shift at all. So what we are living, it's a transition to a more chaotic, a more diversified thing. But then afterwards, we'll have a more central thing with more unified values. But my final point, it's very difficult to recognize the other. And then we enter into psychoanalysis, which I think is a bit too much.
Which is terribly expensive. Ambassador?
Well, a very, very quick reaction, to diversity, which is a reality, which is not assumed by everybody. So I think that some of the powers have to better assume their own diversity and address it and make sure they make room for everybody, but still have a common destiny. This is very difficult, to achieve, but still I think it is one basic issue. In other countries, we have to promote better diversity, but to make sure that at the same time we are fine-tuning this diversity to make sure that we have consensus over common issues. With no consensus, you cannot get democracy, because then you have a chaos and you have cacophony, because everyone is singing his own song and you have no concert. So I think that we have both challenges from the old traditional powers and the rising in the region. It is a large question of diversity, but we still have to fine-tune it. This is the first thing, to make sure that we go to these cross-cutting issues, which are absolutely basic, where we need to have a consensus, and core issues with priority. This is the first thing. This problem, just to finish on the new realities that we have to cope with, I think that we do need to adjust to new realities and to this new system with the acceleration of history, and still make sure that we should make dialogue prevail over confrontation. And this is very hard, because it's much easier said than done. And unfortunately, where dialogue and coordination should prevail, most of the time we see only hegemony on behalf of the traditional people who are holding the power, and they don't want really to relinquish it. And we see a lot of tension and competition among the new risers. So I think this is a very delicate exercise, but we should all try to do homework to make sure we make dialogue prevail over confrontation, to make a smoother transition to this new uncertain multipolarity.
Right, and dialogue is what this is about. Ambassador, briefly?
Absolutely. Very briefly. I mean, this was a creative discussion. There were calls for return to the 19th century, as well as provision of chaos before order. I'm much more pragmatic. I think we have to assume that the world is getting more complicated, is getting more unpredictable, less safe. Long gone are the days of the Cold War. We more or less knew what to expect. This is much more difficult to manage. It requires creativity. It requires commitment and engagement of all the actors, each of them assuming their responsibilities. Very quickly on the point of values, I think my German colleague summarized in the best possible way. But let me just remind you of one small item. The Western values are simply the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So they are not Western as much as they are Eastern or South or North. They are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, you know, I just wanted to recall that small point. On the governance of the world, I think we can expect a complex system. It won't be easy. I mean, we will have networks, we will have different levels, we will need the institutions. I'm an institutionalist. Our project in Europe is based on institutions. I believe international institutions are more than necessary. Multilateralism is more than necessary. But I think that we have to accept that there will be other levels of governance. The regional one, I fully agree with Charles. The emergence of other individual actors that will have a role to play in different areas of the world, in different themes that we have to discuss. It will be complex. It requires creativity. I think we should all engage. My last point is I don't want to forget the mandate of the German Marshall Fund, which is for transatlantic, strengthening transatlantic cooperation. And I believe that the US and the EU, as much as I believe that the Atlantic countries of South America and the Atlantic countries of Africa have a role to play, have a responsibility to assume, and in fact have an opportunity, because I think what I've heard yesterday and today is that the Atlantic is an opportunity. Why not seize this opportunity? Test some of the ideas in the Atlantic, because we have so much in common. We don't have instability yet, but we may have in the future. We still have maybe time to find ways and means to have an Atlantic governance, cooperation, respecting the diversity. But I would like to call for both EU-US leadership, because we have the responsibility that we said you have, so we have to assume that responsibility, and cooperation across the Atlantic in areas where people freely, voluntarily want to cooperate. I think this is at least what I take from the discussions here.
Charles Kupchan, why don't you finish it off for us?
Yeah, I'll just touch on two issues. On this whole question of regionalism versus globalism that you raised, I think you're right to say that there are many issues out there ranging from financial flows to climate change to nuclear proliferation that are global in nature. They need to be addressed globally. My concern is they won't be addressed globally. It won't happen, simply because there's an absence of consensus, and we live in a world in which there's a gap between the demand for global governance and its supply. What's the second best option? Get some regional infrastructure and then try to build up from there. And so I would much rather start regional and work towards global compacts than aim high and come home empty-handed. On this issue of Western values that we've been talking about, I mean, Western values is a very slippery word. Yeah. And I think that there is a floor, a core set of Western values, including the human rights issues that you mentioned, that are non-negotiable. But I also think that the Western order that has been built over the last couple of centuries is much more than that, and there are smuggled in a lot of assumptions about religion, about markets, about how to organize life, both politically and socially, that are not exportable and that are not going to travel through many different parts of the world. And I think the answer, in my mind, is what you said, and look for synthesis. Look for ways in which our dialogue and narrative intersects with and create new kinds of compacts that are partly Western and partly non-Western. And the final point I'd end with is that I think that what I would like to see more of is newer emerging regions and parties getting in the game more regularly, which is partly what we're doing in this room. But I think if Egypt and Turkey got together and made a bold initiative on Syria, or you had emerging powers doing things, contributing to public goods, and not just saying, we don't like this, don't do this, we don't like this institution, that would be a major step forward in getting us to this next world. We need more input, more juice from newer and emerging powers. Because I don't think the impetus is going to come from the West alone. It's got to come from what we probably inappropriately call the rest.
Yeah.
And the more input that comes from the emerging world, the more quickly, and I think the more likely it is, we get to some sort of rule-based system, and that, to me, is the ultimate goal.
Thank you all very much, and we would all be honored if you would keep the dialogue going on. There are plenty more opportunities in this conference to do just that. Thank you, and thank you to the panelists.
And thank you, Lisa Mullins. That was a terrific panel, everybody. So we're going to give you a 7-minute and 45-second coffee break. Go out, slurp down a cup of coffee, grab something to eat, come on back in. We're going to have the last session of the day. A really terrific panel focused on the future of cities. Thank you.